This story takes us back to 1986, behind the Iron Curtain, and is about a game of Russian roulette. But instead of a loaded revolver, it was being played with a loaded plane full of passengers. The date was 20th October 1986. Aeroflot Flight 6502 had taken off from Kolsovo Airport in Sverdlovsk, heading towards Grozny. The flight had one scheduled stopover in Kurumuk Airport of Samara. The aircraft was a Tu-134A with a crew of 7 carrying some 87 passengers aboard. The crew consisted of Alexander Kluyev, pilot in command, co-pilot Gennady Zirnov, Ivan Mokhono, navigating officer, Yuri Kamzatov, flight engineer, and 3 flight attendants. The first part of the flight was unremarkable. The takeoff and time in the air up until the dreadful landing in Kuibyshev were just fine. We can only imagine what they were talking about during the flight, but apparently when nearing their stopover in Kuibyshev, a bet was made between co-pilot Gennady Zirnov and the commander. Kliyev was dared to show his skills by landing the aircraft blind and using only the cockpit instruments. Apparently, Kliyev accepted the challenge, and at 3:48 p.m. at a height of 1300 feet, flight engineers pulled blinds over the windshield and the crew started to descend towards Kuibyshev. The pilot also refused any radio assistance and ignored the NDB landing approach suggested by the tower control. When the descent had reached the height of about 210 feet, the plane control alarmed a ground proximity warning, which Alexander Kluyev also ignored, and instead of making a go around and making a second attempt as stated by the rules, he continued his landing approach. The plane eventually touched the ground at a speed exceeding 170 miles per hour, 132 meters past the runway threshold at a vertical speed of 5 meters per second. This translated to 4.8 Gs. The landing gear broke off on impact and the plane jumped off the track. Its right wing tore off while the left one folded in half, spilling fuel, while the plane was rolling over in midair and eventually fell on the ground and turned upside down, some 700 feet away from the point of touchdown. A few short moments later, the plane burst into flames. The crash had instantly killed 63 people, 4 of which were part of the crew. 7 more died later in the hospital. A secret report on the case that was made public at a later date gave slightly different numbers: 85 passengers and 8 crew, 53 passengers dying instantly, as well as 5 crew members, 11 more dying later in a hospital. It is unknown what led to this difference in the report. All available police squads, fire brigades, and ambulances were called in to help. Ironically, pilot in command Alexander Kliyev and co-pilot Gennady Zirnov, whose bet caused all this, survived the crash. However, co-pilot Zirnov did not hesitate and immediately started helping others and evacuating as many passengers as he could. He was reported to have shown his head out of the plane just to catch a breath and immediately jumped back to help with the rescue. He later died from a cardiac arrest caused by a large amount of smoke that he had inhaled. Kliyev survived the incident to be later prosecuted. The first-hand reports by the policemen and firemen who rushed to the rescue were gruesome and horrific, describing the burning interior of the plane, the stench of the flesh, the people who died during the crash still fastened to their seats hanging from the ceiling, which was actually the floor. Eventually the seat belts melted or burned away and the bodies of those who died started falling over the rescuers. Not all were able to contemplate such a terrible picture without a shudder. The sight of the corpses and the sickening smell of burning meat made many of us vomit. At the same time, there was such a suffocating smell in the cabin from the burned out material that it was only possible to work wearing a gas mask, said V. Fragin, one of the first firefighters who arrived at the scene of the crash. The firefighters had to fight the flames and smoke while also looking for survivors among the burning debris and bodies. As I dived into the smoke-blackened hull rift, I immediately saw the dead men hanging over my head, strapped in seat belts. After all, the plane had turned over the crash, and all the seats with passengers as a result were upside down as if on the ceiling. Many of the corpses were completely naked, while others only lacked shoes. All this was either torn off by the current of air or burned in the flames. Much of the information that we have now comes from police officer Sergei Churilov and Fire Department Chief Colonel A.K. Karpov. They were among the first people that came to the scene. The Soviet police soon arrived at the scene and cordoned the plane off. The KGB followed soon to make sure the gruesome details about the accident would not be leaked to the public. as it was the usual Soviet practice to censor information. It's thanks to the firefighter Frygin that photos of the burning plane survived and were distributed. I not only dragged the corpses out of the plane, but following my duty, I also tried to take as many photos of the scene as possible. I figured they would then be very useful for the following investigation of the causes of the tragedy, said Frygin. However, the KGB agents at the scene stopped the firefighter and retrieved one of the two films he had shot. The other film Frygin passed on to his colleague and instructed him to hide it. In the aftermath of the airplane crash, the investigators concluded that it was the pilot's fault. The captain had violated flight rules and the co-pilot did not take measures to avert the crash. Main pilot Captain Alexander Kliev was tried in court, in a closed hearing where no press was allowed, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was released after serving 6, probably by amnesty after the fall of the communist regime. Co-pilot Gennady Zhirnov could not be tried or questioned as he had died in the hospital from a cardiac arrest. Information about this accident was covered up for 2 years and it was reported officially only in 1988. It had been a sort of a habit for the Soviets to cover up any information regarding such accidents. It was only when there were foreign passengers aboard or many civilian witnesses for the crash that the Soviets allowed any information to reach the media. That information cover-up used primarily to keep the image of Aeroflot as the most secure airline company in the world. The official statistics for emergency landings and crashes that Aeroflot had been showing to the world were pointing towards them being an almost perfect and error-proof airline operator when compared to Western airline companies who couldn't cover up their mishaps. The deadly bet caused the death of 70 people, including 14 children, and left countless more people suffering the loss of their loved ones.